We would now like to move to the question of the just transition, another important part of the report and obviously of the COP27 discussions. And with that, I'm absolutely delighted that we have Malango Mughogho with us, who is the Managing Director of ZeniZeni Sustainable Finance and another member of the HLAC group from South Africa. Thank you very much for being with us, and I know that you will be not only introducing the issue, but then sharing the discussion. So thank you for making my life even easier. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for that introduction. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're dialing in from, welcome, and thank you so much for joining this session. I'm based in Johannesburg, so greetings from South Africa to all of you. And of course, the first session has already spoken about the Integrity Matters report. And I think it's important to start off by saying that the concept of a just transition is embedded in the UN Convention on Climate Change Framework Convention on Climate Change, and of course in the Paris Agreement itself. So these are important. The just transition is an important principle that cuts across everything related to the UNFCCC. And that's why one of our key principles, as in our recommendations report, Integrity Matters, covered the just transition in the sense that all non-state entities, from a principles perspective, need to include issues, considerations of justice and equity in whatever they plan and all their commitments. So it's a very important part of the recommendations. So we know that net zero is a process. Reaching net zero is a process that can't happen overnight. We need to transition to that place of net zero, and in some cases, complete zero for certain industries. And the just transition speaks to that, in effect, how we transition, how fast we transition, who is affected by that transition, what opportunities arise from that transition. So one of our recommendations in particular, relates to the fact that it will affect individuals as well. We know that there are some sectors, for example, in the fossil fuel sector, where people will lose their jobs. In the certain other sectors, the same will happen. And indeed, it's potentially millions of individuals who will be affected. And these individuals are, of course, parts of communities, towns, cities, regions, and indeed countries where this transition will be happening. So they'll all be affected. The key thing is that the way in which they will be affected will be different. It's dependent on many, many different factors, including geographic location. For example, I'm based in the African continent, and we know that temperature rises, global average temperature rises of, say, 2 degrees are actually higher on average in many African countries than that 2 or 1.5 degrees. It's also affected by income levels, people's ability to access things like insurance, etc., affect the transition. And of course, age, and very importantly, gender. So in many different countries, research shows that women and children in particular are affected more greatly by certain climate change impacts. So all these impacts we know will happen, but we don't know exactly how they'll impact people, and we just know that there'll be a significant difference. So it's very important that non-state entities take this into account. And at the same time, there cannot be a one-size-fits-all, given all those different factors and the different countries that are involved, different sectors. We know that it's impossible to say that this is the one way of achieving a just transition in an equitable way. I think the approach needs to be tailored to specific contexts and situations, which makes it complex, but it's very doable. And ultimately, from a non-state entities perspective, this can really only be done through credible engagement with stakeholders. So directly affected individuals, of course, and then the communities and various different supply chains or industries that are indirectly affected by the transition. So stakeholder consultation is critical. And so concepts such as free, prior, and informed consent around this are really important for non-state entities to take into account as they address the just transition. So for example, here in South Africa, already the transition is happening. We're a very coal-dependent economy, and some communities have already spoken about ghost towns being created. And this is, of course, as say either coal mining, for example, decreases, and the towns that support those mining, that were built to support those mining activities, then have lost their, call it economic lifeblood, as it were. So the transition is already happening in some places, and we need to avoid the ghost towns. There are lessons that we can learn from other transitions that have happened in other parts of the world. These are things that are not unknown to us, and it's very important that these issues are taken into account, and the communities themselves are consulted as non-state entities, particularly companies and financial institutions, make their transition plans. Another aspect of the transition, which is often not thought about, is the impacts on nature. We know from the IPCC and other scientific reports that deforestation, for example, due to land use change and agriculture in particular, is a significant contributor to global emissions, approximately about 11%. So we know that to reach net zero by 2050 on a global level, deforestation needs to end as quickly as possible. And this is why we have specific recommendations related to deforestation, which I'll come to. But linked to that, deforestation is, addressing deforestation is also an equity issue, because many lands that can be reforested, or where afforestation can take place or deforestation can be arrested, are under the custodianship of indigenous peoples and communities who are often already marginalized, and should not be marginalized further by any attempts to address net zero. And also they can also be, if brought into the process, there are significant benefits that can be accrued to them if they are consulted early on in the plans to address deforestation. So coming to our actual recommendations then, related to this, I'm going to read out from a piece of paper to make sure I get them right. But our main recommendations around people and nature in the just transition relate to two, call them subsectors of non-state entities. Firstly, those with material land use emissions, and secondly, financial institutions. So our recommendations for those with material land use impacts is that as part of their plans, businesses, cities, and regions must achieve and maintain operations and supply chains that avoid conversion of remaining ecosystems, eliminating deforestation and peatland loss by 2025 at the latest, and the conversion of other remaining natural ecosystems by 2030. So those dates are also important, and that's going back in relation to the impacts that I already mentioned about deforestation. So this is where, this is for entities that have material land use emissions. And then for financial institutions, our main recommendation is that they should have a policy of not investing or financing businesses linked to deforestation, and should eliminate agricultural commodity-driven deforestation from their investment and credit portfolios by 2025 as part of their net zero plan. So again, a date that is not too far into the future to reflect the need for deep emissions cuts from issues related to deforestation and other land use changes. And as I mentioned earlier, given that the reversal of nature loss is actually a social and a justice issue because of the the fact that we all rely on those ecosystems, but also the many communities that live within those ecosystems. We also recommend that businesses invest in protection and restoration of ecosystems beyond the emissions reductions in their own operations and supply chains. So this, you could call it, or can think of it as being broad responsible citizens, recognizing that ecosystem degradation is not just relevant for climate issues and reaching net zero, but for more broadly for our overall well-being and sustainable, and indeed sustainable development. And of course, one of the ways that this can be done is through the purchase and retirement of high integrity carbon credits. And there's another recommendation that we have in relation to the use of voluntary carbon credits in particular, that they must be high integrity and in that sense must at a minimum be additional. So in other words, they wouldn't, without that financing, they wouldn't have taken place. That activity wouldn't have taken place. And secondly, they must be permanent. We need permanent removal of carbon emissions in order to reach global net zero by 2050. So just before I hand over to start the discussion part of this conversation, I think it's important to note that the just transition we've effectively woven it into several other recommendations. So whilst there is one which covers the just transition in particular, the concept of a just transition is implicit in several other recommendations, in particular related to the transition plans. So any plan by a non-state entity must demonstrate and show how they address just transition issues. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it is quite complex. So we'd not expect that a non-state entity would come up with these the plans themselves. It needs to be through effective stakeholder consultation. But it's very important that the plans are explicit about how the just transition aspects are addressed. And interestingly, the research by the Net Zero Tracker shows that while a third of the world's largest publicly traded businesses have made net zero commitments, which in itself is important and commendable, unfortunately, only half of those show how their targets are embedded in corporate strategy. And as you know, without a strategy, it's almost impossible to begin to understand how an outcome will be achieved, in this case, the just transition. And just as importantly, often without a strategy, it's impossible for financing or funding to be allocated towards those actions. So these potentially are meaningless commitments without that. So it's very important that this be addressed.